want to begin first of all with my mother. My mother was born in a town in what used to be called Galicia and is now western Ukraine, in a town called Tarnopol, which was horrendously anti-Semitic, to Tova and Nachum Leiner. Nachum was a bookkeeper, and they came from a Zionist family. Two of Nachum's brothers emigrated to what was then Palestine. But my mother's sole memory of Poland was a time when she was a small child, and she was put in front of the class by the teacher, and was called a parshiva Žid, which means a dirty Jew. That scarred her for life, and she refused to speak Polish when I was growing up, and only did so in her 70s when she came with my father to Poland and spoke in a church, and they knew she was born and raised in Poland, and she had no choice but to speak Polish. In the mid-30s, my grandfather, who did business with ethnic Germans, was warned by one of those business associates that bad times were coming to the Jews because this fellow traveled to Germany, saw what was going on in Nazi Germany, and he said to Mr. Leiner, you need to take your family and emigrate to Palestine, and that's what he did. First of all, sent my grandmother and mother and uncle to Israel, to Palestine, and we eventually came there. My grandfather died of tuberculosis, which in those years was a Jewish disease. I never knew him. Then on my father's side, Hyman and Berta Urbach lived in a town called Skoczów, in a portion of Poland that is called Silesia, which went back and forth from Poland to Germany, which is why my father grew up speaking both German and Polish, and then eventually added another 5 languages to the roster. When the war broke out, my father was 17 years old, and he had a sense of what was coming, and he fled eventually along with his brother to Western Russia with his father's blessing. His father prayed the Aaronic blessing over him and said, I'm too old to leave, you go. And the Soviet government took the refugees and packed them into cattle cars and shipped them to Siberia, to labor camp, where they labored for a year. And for some unknown reason, after a year, they were released. And my father and his brother wandered through that part of the Soviet Union and eventually wanted to escape to cross over into Afghanistan, but were caught at the border by the Soviet border guard, and they were put in prison, where a severe epidemic of typhus took place, and my uncle died, who would have been my uncle Ernest or Mordechai. My father almost died, but there was a medic there at the hospital, a woman who was very compassionate, in the prison, who put him into the infirmary, and that saved his life. He was eventually released and made his way to Western Russia, joined up with the Red Army, and eventually came with the Red Army to Poland, at which point he deserted because his attitude was, I'm done with the Soviets. He came to his hometown and found that his very large family was no longer there, and strangers were living in his house. To backtrack for a minute, my grandfather had a large family, and he was a self-made man. He came and eventually built up a business. He had an inn, a restaurant, and his first wife died, and his children had married, had children of their own, and were not taking proper care of him according to his specification. And so he went to the shadchan, to the matchmaker, and said, I need a wife. It's one of those things like there was a story about an Israeli farmer wanting to marry a woman who had a tractor, and he said in this ad, if interested, please send me a picture of the tractor. And that was somewhat like what my grandfather was. He wanted someone who would take care of the business. And my grandmother, Berta, was 38 at the time, an old spinster, and came from a very poor family. And so she jumped at the opportunity. They had a couple of kids. And my grandfather was very successful. He was a big macher in the community. He was the president of the community, the president of the shul. I found out when we came to Poland that he had a fight with the rabbi, and the rabbi was fired.
Watch out, son.
So he was a man of strong personality that he passed on to my father, and my father eventually came to Germany, and eventually then made his way to France, to Marseille, and boarded a ship. He was illegal on the ship, although the ship was legal, and came to Israel and met my mother, and within 6 weeks married. And it was the same kind of situation like some of the other stories of, wasn't a love match, it was lonely, really, my whole world was turned upside down, so they married. And it was not exactly a love at first sight kind of a marriage, nor they somehow, by the grace of God, stuck together for 57 years. And so as a child growing up in Israel, I knew nothing about my father's experiences. And I came to find out later that that was fairly typical of Holocaust survivors. The original PTSD, that you go through these horrendous experiences and they're so overwhelming that you cannot absorb them, and there's a part of you that shuts down and represses all these memories. Eventually, a young gal that worked with my father started to write his story down, and he looked at it and put it away in a drawer. And then 10 years or so later, a gal who worked with him as his volunteer secretary saw that, and she prevailed on him that he should have the story written. And she interviewed him, and so for 6 weeks he had nightmares. And she took the manuscript and gave me the manuscript, and that was the first time that I was exposed to 95% of my father's experiences. I was in my 30s then, and I was blown away because I saw that he went from place to place, and he survived, and he knew the hand of God.